on. Can you advance to the next slide?
Yes. Sorry. Let's see. Come on. Okay.
So what we're going to talk about today is dopamine, and it's a very integral part about addiction. So we'll understand the neurobiology of the brain and how that's related to pain and addiction. We'll talk about addiction so that we understand the difference between what tolerance is, dependence is, and addiction. Opiates, we'll talk about the understanding of pain and how opiates work, because that really has a lot to do with the drug crisis that we're involved with today. And then we'll talk about the national crisis and talk about some of the factors which led to the national opiate and drug crisis. Next slide. So this is kind of a slide that really talks about why this is a drug crisis as opposed to just an opioid crisis. This is data that has been collated from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And as you look at this, you can see that 80% or more than 80% of all drug overdose deaths involved opiates, some type of an opiate. And as you hear me talk about this, I'll talk about opiates. Opiates are a class of medications or a class of drugs that are used oftentimes for pain. There are opiates that are natural occurring. They're made from the poppy plant, such as morphine. And now we have opiates that have been developed from a laboratory. So I kind of use the example of GMO and non-GMO. So morphine, stuff like that is natural. It would be the non-genetically modified opiate, whereas some of the drugs that we use and some of the illicit drugs that we see, they are the GMO or genetically modified drugs. 85% or nearly 85% of overdose deaths involved illicitly manufactured fentanyls, heroin, cocaine, or meth. So you can see that those were in either singularly in those deaths or in a combination. And that's what we're really starting to see is the combination. I'll get into the specifics of that as we move through the talk tonight. And then what for me is most concerning, because my ultimate job is to try to keep people from dying from drug overdose deaths first and foremost. And you can see that 3 in 5, there were people who died of a drug overdose deaths. There was an opportunity to link the people to care or to implement life-saving actions before they died. So an example is someone who may have just come out of jail and then they overdosed while they were in jail. The actions could have been taken to assist them. People who were in treatment facilities, people who were in emergency rooms or hospitals are examples of places where we could have intervened to try to keep this person from dying or from overdosing. Next slide. So I often get asked, why are we going to study drugs use and addiction? And as I already alluded to, the biggest reason that I'm concerned is that tens of thousands of people die every year from drug overdose deaths, both from the illegal or illicit and also from prescription drugs. So we want to stop that. That's considered a public health emergency because so many people have been dying. At one time, the statistics were more people had died of drug overdose deaths in the past, like 5 years than had died from the soldiers in the Vietnam Wars. And then also the use and misuse of drugs cost us more than $700 billion a year. And just to get you, it's in, loss of productivity, loss of jobs, healthcare, and all of those different amounts go into that $7 billion a year. Just to give you an idea of what that would equate to is some of our Fortune 100 companies, top 5 companies, and it was Apple, their proceeds every year are about $700 billion a year. So we lose that in costs to Americans in what one company is making a year. So it's staggering amounts of money that we're losing. Next slide. So I often ask, why do people take drugs? There are reasons to take drugs. There are legitimate medical reasons to take drugs. As you can see, one of the reasons that people take drugs is to feel good. So say that I, may take supplements to make me feel good. Or some people take drugs just because they alter the mind. That makes them feel good. Some people take them to feel better. Say someone has an injury or they have a headache. They may take a drug in order to feel better. Go ahead and advance. Next slide. They may take it to do better too. There is go ahead and go back. That's okay. They will do better. So sometimes drugs can make people, like if they're people who have certain types of disorders, they take those. Someone who has problems with concentration, they may take a drug that helps them perform better in school. And then there's also the curiosity and social factor. It's, as somebody knows someone else who's doing them and that person, says, hey, you want to try this? And so then they will try it. So some of those reasons are legitimate reasons to do them. So what's the problem? The problem is, as we go on to the next slide, that initially someone may start taking a drug voluntarily. And studies have been done that show that most people that became addicted to drugs, if they would have known by taking that initial drug that they would have become addicted, they never would have done it. But you don't know when you first take that. So it's a voluntary decision. There's a lot of stigma that has existed and continues to exist because some people believe that drug addiction it's a lifestyle choice or it's a flaw in someone's character, but we'll talk about why that's not. So that voluntariness, and that's what, if they'd never tried it, they never would have become addicted. So that speaks to that the initial decision was voluntary often. But the problem is people continue to use whatever the drug is, their ability to exert the self-control, it can become critically impaired. And that's where we really go from use of drugs or legitimate use into the hallmark of addiction. And we'll talk about, and I'll show you some images, brain imaging studies that show there are physical changes that occur in the brain that show addiction. And the areas that are affected in the brain are areas that have to deal with judgment, learning and memory, and behavior control. And that's what helps to explain this compulsive nature of addiction. And again, we'll talk more about that as we move on. Next slide. So I often get asked too, as I talk to various groups, is why do some people become addicted and others do not? So, say that I am given a prescription for pain, an opiate prescription for pain, and Miss Bean is given an opioid prescription for pain. She doesn't become addicted and I become addicted. Why is that? Well, it's different from person to person. There's no single factor as to what will determine. There is a genetic factor that we will talk about, but just because someone has the genetic predisposition doesn't mean that they will become addicted. And there are other people that don't have that genetic predisposition, but they become addicted. So we don't know. We'll talk about some of the risk factors. The more risk factors that someone has, the greater their chance of that taking drugs will lead to addiction. And then protective factors will help to reduce a person's risk of addiction. Next slide. And we'll talk about a few of these. This is not by any means an all-inclusive list of risk factors and protective factors, but this will show you. Oftentimes it's been seen that a very aggressive behavior in young children versus children who have good self-control. So there's that risk factor and the protective factor. Lack of parental supervision is a risk factor, whereas parental involvement, some of you may not love hearing this, but parental involvement, monitoring, and support really do help provide a protective factor. Poor social skills are an example of a risk factor, whereas someone who is able to build positive relationships and can really maneuver through these social relationships is a protective factor. Drug experimentation is a risk factor, whereas they have found that good grades, being involved in activities at school, whether it's sports or extracurricular activities, has been shown to be a protective factor. Availability of drugs to people at schools versus the protective factor of schools that have anti-drug policies. And then community poverty. We've heard a lot about community poverty lately in terms of risk factors for people getting the coronavirus, or a risk factor for people not being able to get the vaccination. And also within our state, we know that sometimes in our more rural and frontier counties, they don't have as many resources, which is a protective factor, available to them right within their community. They have to sometimes travel many, many miles and hours to get to some of the resources that are right in your backyard. Next slide. So this really does play a part in that whole setup in terms of risk factors versus protective factors for drug use. There's also a genetic component. I won't get real deep into this. This isn't my specialty, but in terms, if you look at this slide, what this is showing you is a certain type, they call it an allele. That's a genetic, your genetic makeup. As many of you know, there's all these genetic tests you can take now, 23andMe and others, where you can do a swab of your mouth and send it in. It will tell you what your genetic factor is. Some people do that to see if they have relatives that they didn't know were out there, but it can also tell you predisposition for different medical conditions such as this. So in this general population, they have this protective allele, whereas people that have, in this particular study, they looked at people that were addicted to heroin and cocaine, they did not have as many people in the study that had that predisposition. So what I mean by this is that just like some people have a genetic makeup where they may be more prone to be diabetic, or they may be more prone to be have heart disease. And what this shows you is that even within the brain, these different genetic factors can really affect the receptor levels within the brain. So this gets down to the cellular level. And you can see on here, on any of these brain imaging slides that I'm going to be showing you, whenever there's reds and orange, that shows high activity. When it's into the cooler colors of greens and blues, there's not as much activity. Receptors are in the brain. You can see that this particular genetic makeup really helps to uptake or to make the person have more effects to that drug than somebody who doesn't have this same genetic makeup. So again, it's just like I said, if someone is predisposed, it's not necessarily that they're good, but what it means is that, and we'll talk about that, there are some cases where drugs can be used, but what this is saying is that this particular person, because they have so much more activity in their brain, that they would be more likely to feel the effects of the drug than somebody who didn't have that same activity in their brain. What this particular study looked at, it was again looking at the genetic makeup of people that were predisposed for having the risk for schizophrenia and the use of marijuana. So you can see the first one that says MET at the bottom. The people that had that genetic makeup had about the same incidence of schizophrenia, whether they used marijuana or didn't. The second one that shows the VAL-MET genetic makeup, you can see the VAL is people that did not develop schizophrenia, and the people with the MET had a much higher level of developing schizophrenia with cannabis use. The yellow is adolescents that didn't use cannabis but developed schizophrenia. And then the last one you can see on here is that VAL to VAL. That particular one is that the people who did not use cannabis that developed schizophrenia, it's very low, yellow, but the blue bar, that VAL genetic code, is really something that the people were more predisposed to have schizophrenia. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the brain and how the natural cellular level works with having drugs. So next slide. Within our brain, we have specific pathways that are always working. So if anyone out there is, for example, a runner, and they've heard about a runner's high, these are the pathways that are working. There is basically that what they call our natural dopamine in the brain, endorphins. And when somebody, for example, runs and gets that runner's high, you can see that in the blue in this brain, that blue pathway, there's the VTA, that's a ventricular tegmental area. Dopamine is released, or in this case, a natural endorphins. It goes to that nucleus accumbens and it goes up to the prefrontal cortex. And this becomes important because it has to do with certain functions in the body and have to do with, judgment control, those sorts of things. The red pathway is basically showing that the uptake again, and it has to do with our memory, processing, cognition, and those sorts of things. So as these chemicals are in our brain, it will really ignite these different pathways that happen in the brain. And when I talked about the endorphins or the natural dopamine, drugs will work on this pathway. And this is why we call it a brain disease. And we'll talk about why drug addiction is a brain disease. Next slide. So again, at the cellular level, dopamine, endorphins, they will be released. They'll go across that little synapse you see and then hit on those blue little dopamine receptors. So that's how in the brain all of this works, and that you get an effect from whether it's natural endorphins or from dopamine that's released because of drug use. Next slide. So in the brain, there's binding sites, and this means that this is where the opiates will work in the brain. And as I showed you previously, that small little purple area that goes across from that VTA over to the nuclear accumbens, you can see that's a large area where opiates will bind in the brain. Next slide, and we'll talk about why that becomes important. So down at the very cellular level, I showed you the dopamine releases. It goes across to those little blue rods and it connects to them. Opiates will get into that cellular level, and they will also have receptors where they are taken into the brain and cause the effects throughout the body. This is all happening at the brain level. And there are studies that show the more that someone uses different, in this case, opiates, these receptors really don't work as well. So we'll get into why that becomes important here in a few slides. Next slide. As I said, there is a legitimate reason to take some medications, or what we call illicit. Those are drugs that are used for a legitimate purpose. So if someone is in pain, someone breaks their leg, someone has, pain from the disease process, next slide, then they will often be given, whether it's Tylenol or whether it's an opiate, depending on what the pain is and how it's going to be treated. But you can see that there are pain receptors, these nociceptors. They're in the skin, the walls of organs, deep tissues, muscles, and joints. And when something happens, in this case, someone hits their thumb with a hammer, these nociceptors will send that signal through the spinal cord and up into the brain. Next slide. And then what happens is the brain will send that signal back down through the spinal cord to the nociceptors to let you know that that hurts. It's kind of like if anybody's ever touched a hot stove or a hot surface. This happens in, less than seconds. It happens immediately. So this is a process that goes on. What happens with opiates is that they will stop or slow that process either down between these nociceptors to the spinal cord, or they'll stop it from the spinal cord up into the brain so that you don't feel that pain. So that's really how these pain medications work, is they interrupt these signals that are being sent from the nociceptors to the brain and back. Next slide. What happens is that opioids, as you can see on here, are good for analgesic or for pain. That's a good side effect, if you will, that these are used for. The problem becomes is when these drugs are used and they lead to, as you can see in the red, tolerance, dependence, constipation, nausea, and vomiting. And the worst one is, which is what we see often with opiates, is that they can cause respiratory depression. What that means is they cause you to stop breathing, and you have to be breathing in order to live. So if you stop breathing, then you, from an overdose or from too much use of these opiates, then it will lead to that, and that's what leads to death. Next slide. So while opiates can really help us in terms of alleviating pain, if too many are taken, they can lead to these adverse side effects that we don't want. The way that we really got to the opioid crisis in the United States is, as you can see, what this slide depicts is, this is information from the Drug Enforcement Agency, and it shows the sale of opiates, prescription painkillers from 1999 all the way, you can see, up to 2013. You can see that the prescribing of these opiate painkillers, as it increased and the sales of these opiates increased over the years, what we saw with that bottom line, that orange line, was that there was an increase in deaths. You can see they almost match each other. As more opiates and pain pills, these prescription pain pills were sold, we had a lot more deaths. Next slide. So as we continued out from 2013, that continued on. In the beginning, one of the objectives was to talk about the difference between tolerance, dependence, and then addiction. And tolerance, as you can see here, is a state when an organism no longer responds to a drug, and you have to have a higher dose to achieve that same effect. So if any of you drink coffee or drink energy drinks that have caffeine, it's the same effect with that. Whereas you may take one cup of coffee or one energy drink for a long time, and that would wake you up and help give you energy. Over time, if you drank that one every day, it wouldn't have the same effect. You'd have to drink more in order to get that same, awakened feeling. It's the same with opiates and other drugs. The more you have them, you need a higher dose in order to get the same effects. And this has to do with that dopamine that's produced in the brain. As you take that one, let's say, can of an energy drink, it no longer is giving you that dopamine, isn't being released and taken up into the brain like it was. So you need to take more to get that same level. Next slide. And we'll talk about, I said it's a brain disease. Addiction is a brain disease. And the reason it's a brain disease is that when someone becomes tolerant to that drug, what happens is you can see that little red arch that goes across the brain from that ventricular tegmental area over to the nuclear accumbens. This is where dependence starts to develop, because as I told you, you need more of that to get the same amount of dopamine released in that area of the brain in order to get the same effect. So you would have to take more and continue to take more. And that's where people get into problems with the opiates and other drugs, is because they take more to get the same effect, whether it's pain relief or that feeling of euphoria, because they're not getting it anymore. Next slide. Dependence is a state which the organism only functions normally in the presence of that drug. And there will actually be physical disturbances when that drug is removed, or what we call withdrawal. So with caffeine, someone can go through withdrawal. If you've ever tried to stop drinking coffee or taking energy drinks, you'll notice when you first go off it, you might be a little jittery, get a headache. That's actually withdrawal, but it's on a much, much lower level than withdrawal from opiates or withdrawal from psychostimulants. When it's withdrawal from some of these other drugs, such as opiates or stimulants, it can cause death, as we talked about, because it can lead to that respiratory depression where you're not breathing. It can lead to cardiac, heart attack, stroke, many other things, which we'll talk about later. Next slide. So the regions of the brain that are involved with dependence, we talked about, there was the region of the brain, which you can see on this slide, that red arch, which was that ventricular tegmental area over to the nuclear accumbens. But now that we get into dependence, there's a second area of the brain that's involved. You can see you can barely see it. There's a small little dot that shows the brainstem is now involved too. So you need more of whatever it was that you were taking to get that release of the dopamine in the brain up here at this area. But then the brainstem also will respond because it needs greater stimulation in order to also feel the effects of that drug. Next slide. So that's the difference between tolerance. Tolerance is that one area. Dependence is two areas of the brain. So we're getting to why this is a brain disease. And addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing brain disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. It's a brain disease because it does change the structure of the brain and how it works. And the changes can be long lasting and can lead to harmful behaviors. So as I talked about with the genetics, and someone can have, their family, heart disease runs in their family. You can see at the bottom of this slide that is a heart, or a heart of someone that on the left side of the screen where all the red shows up, that's someone who has a healthy heart that doesn't have heart disease. But you can see then on the right side where there's some of the blue and a lot less red, their heart has become diseased because of heart disease. So it doesn't function as well as it did when it was healthy with the red picture. On the top, you can see the decreased brain metabolism of someone who had abused drugs. You can see that on the healthy brain that's on the left-hand side, it's more lit up with the yellows. There's more activity going on. You have that metabolism of the dopamine in the brain. But someone who has abused drugs, you can see they don't have as much as that activity. So their brain becomes diseased, just like that heart was diseased in the bottom picture. Next slide. And this is what is the hallmark of addiction. So in the brain, we talked about it being a brain disease. You can see that we talked about the first area, which was that red arch of the VTA to the nuclear accumbens. That was where tolerance developed. When we had dependence, it also brought in that brain stem. And now that we have addiction, it also starts to affect the frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex. So it affects all of those pathways that I showed you in the beginning with the blue pathway, the red pathway for serotonin release. Those all have decreased activity. So someone who has used and abused drugs for a long time, that level of activity decreases all the time. So that's why we see addiction now, because it has affected these three separate areas as opposed to dependence, which was two areas, and tolerance, which was the one area in the brain. Next slide. You often will see people that have chronic health conditions, maybe someone who has cancer, they become tolerant to their medications, but they don't always become addicted. They don't, so they can take what was prescribed for them. Sometimes they will have to take larger doses, but they don't ever go to addiction. And much of the diagnosis of addiction is behavioral based. And what I mean by that is it's not physical, like withdrawal that we talked about, or cravings, but it's the person starts to hazardously use it. They start to have problems with their social and interpersonal relationships because of their use. Maybe they're starting to steal money or steal stuff to pay for drugs so that they can start to feel those same effects they used to feel when they first started, but they need a lot more. They may neglect their roles. They may have had a job, been working, been a student. They stop doing that because all they care about is getting that drug. We talked about going with withdrawal. They develop tolerance. Again, need more and more of whatever it was to achieve the same effects, which leads to the larger amounts, and try to get it for longer periods. They may try to quit because they realize there's a problem, but may quit for a time, go back to it and quit for a time. And much of their time is spent actually using the drugs or trying to get the drugs. So all of this leads into activities they used to be involved with and did, they no longer care about, and will stop that because all of that time is spent really in the pursuit of drugs and using them. Next slide. So those are really the hallmarks of the diagnosis of addiction. What this slide depicts is basically it's looking at the dopamine production in the brain. And you can see in the middle where it says baseline, that says we're all sitting here today, we are producing and then using dopamine. That's our baseline of what we feel for. At the top, you can see in that dark blue, it says the best day ever. Think of what your best day ever was, whatever that is, you know, birthday, graduation, seeing someone you hadn't seen, falling in love, whatever it is. You can see that circle is just slightly bigger than what our baseline. That's that natural dopamine or those endorphins that I talked about that are produced. Not from anything making it happen, but those are produced just by your feelings, by these natural processes that are going on within your body and your brain. You can see that the lighter blue, the marijuana, if someone uses marijuana, the dopamine production is slightly larger than the best day ever. So this chemical that is introduced into the brain produces slightly more, about double the amount of what the natural endorphins are produced on your best day ever. Then at the bottom, you can see the heroin, the green at the bottom, it shows that the dopamine production, if heroin is introduced, is about 3 times as much or 4 times as much as the best day ever, and more than what is produced from marijuana. And then the circle on the left, methamphetamine, you can see that the dopamine that is produced when someone uses methamphetamine is about 10-fold what it was for the best day ever. So the problem comes in is, say someone uses any of these, marijuana, heroin, or meth, and they continue to use it. That amount, in order to produce that amount of dopamine, they need to use more and more all the time, because the dopamine production actually goes down with continued use of this. Next slide. And that's where we get into calling it a brain disease. Think of it this way. This slide really talks about these dopamine receptors, or as they're called here, neurotransmitters. So the dopamine is released, and you have those receptors in the brain that I showed you that actually bind on and use that dopamine. That's how it's done at the cellular level. It's kind of like communications. As I'm talking to you, you hear what I'm saying through your ears. Now, if I were talking to you in another language that you didn't understand, for example, you wouldn't you would hear it, but you wouldn't understand it. Or an example that I like to give is if anyone has ever lived next to a train track or next to a highway or something that produces loud noise, when you first hear it, you hear that noise all the time, it bothers you. But after a while, you kind of get used to it, it becomes white noise. And that's the same with this neurotransmission and receptors in the brain. When the brain is flooded with these different chemicals, whether it's marijuana or whether it's opiates or whether it's psychostimulants, after a while, the brain's flooded with that amount and it kind of can't hear it anymore. So it takes larger amounts in order to be able to have the effect or to hear it, as displayed by this example here. Next slide. So what happens is, we talked about most of the diagnosis of addiction is behavioral based. Because there's a lack of dopamine, if the person doesn't have that drug, they don't have a production of dopamine. So that leads to a craving. This is what the body automatically does. That craving then puts the person into survival mode because they want to get more dopamine production. So they go into, what do I need to do in order to survive, to get more dopamine? Then primal actions are taken. And I equate this back to, this is the same sort of thing of our ancestors back in the day where we didn't have all of the processes and all of the resources we have today. But when people were basically like cavemen, and they would not have dopamine, they would have a lack of dopamine because they were hungry. So they'd have a craving for food. So their survival mode would kick in and they would have to go out and hunt to get food, and in order to solve or to really feed that craving that they had. In this case, it's dopamine, and that's what we talk about. It's the same cycle, whether it's looking for food, looking for caffeine, looking for nicotine, looking for psychostimulants, or looking for opiates in order to produce more dopamine. Next slide. So as we talk about the brain, we talked about the receptors in the brain, the dopamine production. What this slide shows you is dopamine production for 3 separate types of chemicals. We'll call them chemicals that are introduced into the brain. The bottom, the very bottom on the right hand where it says food, that shows that if someone's hungry, they eat. You can see that it starts at 100%. They're at 100 basal release of dopamine. Then when they eat, they go up to 150. And that takes about 40, 50 minutes after they have eaten in order for that dopamine production in the brain to hit up to that peak of 150 of the basal release of dopamine in the brain. Then you can see that happens. And then at an hour, 60 minutes, it starts to go down. At 120 minutes, 2 hours, it starts to go down. And it slowly levels off until it starts all over again and gets back down to that hungry. You get those cravings because you don't have the dopamine, and then you want to eat, so you eat. The next one, the middle one, which is marijuana, it shows that same process going on. It starts at 100 of the basal release of dopamine in the brain, which is the baseline. And in about 20 minutes after someone has had marijuana, it goes up to the same levels, about the same levels as with food, 150. But you can see that the person starts to lose that rate, and it goes down. You can see after 20 minutes, then at 40 minutes, it starts to go down more. At 60 minutes, an hour, it's gone down quite a bit, and out to 80 minutes until it'll go back down to that 100. And then this whole process would start again. At the top graph, you can see for methamphetamine, and I showed you that picture of that large circle about the amount of dopamine that it produces, that methamphetamine or amphetamines produce. So we start at the 100, which again is our baseline of dopamine production in the brain. In about 40 minutes after someone has taken an amphetamine, it goes up to about 1,000 basal release of dopamine in the brain, which was that big circle depiction. And then so that's about not quite 10 times the production of dopamine in the brain for marijuana or for food. But you can see within an hour, it's come down quite a bit. And then over 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, it's come down to almost where it was before. So again, this cycle would start again. There's not that dopamine. Lack of dopamine would lead to a craving. So the person would need to start this cycle all over again in order to get that dopamine production up. Next slide. And that becomes very important. So in order to reach that 1,000 level for amphetamines, for example, because they're not getting as much of the dopamine production, they have to take more of that drug to reach that 1,000 level. So what this slide shows you is brain imaging, and it shows these receptors in the brain that we've been talking about, the dopamine receptors. And you can see that in the very middle, the brain pictures that have some of the red in it, that's the production and the dopamine receptor activity of what they call a control, or someone without, whether it's cocaine, alcohol, or heroin. In these cases, there's good activity. You can see that metabolism in the red. Someone who's become addicted to, on the top, cocaine, in the middle, alcohol, and on the bottom, heroin, you can see there's less activity. And this gets to the fact that we talked about, because there's less activity, not as much dopamine is produced, and not as much dopamine is then be able to be utilized because it's not being metabolized in the brain. So that leads to, again, what we talked about, having to use more in order to get the same effects, but you continue to see less activity. So the person is always trying to get that same activity they had when it first started, but they can't reach it because it becomes a diseased brain, if you will. Next slide. And I talked about the fact it's not just the brain. There can be other implications with addiction, cardiovascular disease. You can imagine that with this increase of dopamine, they also can have cardiac problems, strokes. People have gotten cancer from chronic use of drugs. There's infectious diseases that become involved. Typically, this is because of the use of someone who injects with needles. May see HIV and AIDS because they used it, as they call it, a dirty needle, or hepatitis B and C. There's lung diseases if someone is smoking, because that smoke, it diseases the lungs as well. And then there's mental disorders. Part of the problem that we see with addiction and health is sometimes people can have the mental disorders prior to, or other times the drugs and the addiction can cause the mental disorder, but you don't know which occurred first. But addiction can lead to mental disorders in people who didn't have them previously. Next slide. There's also what we call adulterants in drugs. And these adulterants, these are things that are mixed with the drugs. So there have been some studies done, and we'll talk about that, where whether it was a toxic substance that was used as an adulterant, it can be an impurity, it can be from the process that they use, it can be from fentanyl, and we'll talk about fentanyl and what that is as we go on. And in these particular studies, what was happening was, this was in Brazil, I believe, they were seeing young people, 18 to 22 years old, that should be healthy, that were having chronic diseases that you would see in someone older that would have had this disease process their whole life. And they couldn't figure out why these young people were seeing all of these diseases. And what this study found is some of these adulterants may have caused these additional problems that I talked about in the previous slide because of the adulterants. Next slide. And in this particular study, because this was going on in Brazil, they decided to look at some of the street level drugs here in the United States, in Vermont and Kentucky. And there were 431 street drugs that they tested. And of these drugs, you can see not one single sample that they got had no toxic adulterants in it. The 54% is the drugs that had 1 to 4 toxic adulterants in it. The 5 to 8% is the 15. So they had 5 to 8 different adulterants in the 15%, and then 31% had 9 or more toxic adulterants in it. So, and next slide, I've heard stories of, for example, rat poison being put into drugs, whether it's used as part of the process to make the drug, or it's used to, they will mix it in with the drug sometimes to make more of the drug so that they get a bigger profit margin. But you can see these were some of the adulterants that were found in these drugs that they tested. And it shows here, I put some examples that were from the United States. One was a medication used for expelling worms. It was in cocaine, heroin, and meth here in the United States. And it caused fever and reduced white blood cell production. Acetaminophen, which is an analgesic, was found in heroin and cocaine. And you can see on here that acetaminophen mixed with heroin can really depress or slow the heart rate and breathing. It can lead to acute liver failure or to coma. Then you can see the next drug was a veterinary anesthetic, muscle relaxant, analgesic, or sedative. Those are some of the uses for this third drug. It was found in heroin in the United States. It can use to this respiratory depression, or where you stop breathing. It can lead to where your central nervous system isn't functioning like it should. It can lead to a slow heart rate, and it can lead to a low blood pressure. Then the last one is an anti-malarial medication. It was found in heroin and cocaine. And you can see kidney damage, arrhythmias or bad heart rhythms, cardiovascular toxicity, different syndromes are on here, and a lot. So using the drugs can give the result the person's looking for, but it can also lead to these chronic health problems. Next slide. And one of the studies that was done was that pregnant women who are taking drugs, when their babies are born, their babies basically are feeling the effects of those drugs because they go from the mom into the baby. And what they found is, and this gets to the genetics again that we talked to, an infant that had the blue genetic type, which was AA, they tended to have much longer lengths of stay in the hospital. They required more treatment than the infants with the AG/GG genotype, and they required more medication in order to be treated so that they are no longer feeling the effects of the drugs that were in the mom's system. Next slide. And this particular slide again shows imaging studies of the brain, and it shows brain abnormalities associated with long-term heavy cannabis use. And what this shows is that the red dots that you see are for someone who didn't use cannabis. The green dots are someone who was a long-term heavy cannabis user. And what it caused was a decrease in the size of the hippocampus and the amygdala in the brain. So again, we talked about the chronic effects of drugs. It leads to smaller structures that don't function as well in the brain. Next slide. So I talked about fentanyl. This particular slide shows fentanyl and carfentanil. Fentanyl is a medication that is used. If any of you have ever had surgery where you had to be put under an anesthetic, you may have had fentanyl. There is a legitimate use for fentanyl. Fentanyl is also used for pain control with people with chronic pain, such as cancer patients. But it is also now on the streets as an illegal street drug that's being manufactured not as a prescription medication, but being manufactured as an illegal drug. So, and then carfentanil is the third one, and we'll talk about this in a minute. So the heroin, what this shows you is that it would take that amount of heroin to have an effect on a person. You can see there's a few grains of fentanyl in the bottom of that little container. You would need that much of the fentanyl to have the same effects that you would get from having to take that much of heroin. And then carfentanil, you can see there's one little grain of carfentanil in that last little container. It would take 1 grain of carfentanil in order to get the effects of that same amount of fentanyl and then the amount of heroin. Carfentanil does have a legitimate use, not for people, but the if you will, slang name for carfentanil, it's a veterinary medication. It's called an elephant tranquilizer. So you can imagine a person taking something that would have to tranquilize an elephant who is 10 times bigger than us. Those effects could be detrimental to a human taking them. So as heroin is a natural product, fentanyl and carfentanil are manufactured, or what we call synthetic. So they were man-made and a lot more potent. The problem becomes is those side effects we talked about earlier, where it depresses your drive to breathe. So if you stop breathing, then you would die. Next slide. And we are seeing fentanyl. We have also seen carfentanil in the drug supply within the United States, but also within our state here in your area as well. So can you go back one slide? Sorry. Oh, one more. Go forward. Go forward. Oh, okay. I thought there was something else in there. Never mind. This just shows you that the age-adjusted drug overdose rates by states from 2017 and 2018. And during those years, we felt like we were really making an impact and decreasing the amount of drug overdose deaths through education, through less prescribing of these opiate drugs. And you can see our state here in Nevada, it was statistically similar in 2017 to what it was in 2018. So we started to level off. Next slide. I'll show you that in another way here in just a minute. This is basically what you're seeing for the people who died of drug overdoses in the United States. What type of opiate? The largest percent we were seeing increase from 2017 to 2018 was the synthetic, like the fentanyl and the carfentanil that I told you, the illicit drugs, as opposed to the natural and semi-synthetic opiates, such as pain medications. And then heroin started to level off as well. Next slide. This is stimulants. We are seeing drug overdose deaths from stimulants as well. And you can see that cocaine was from 2017 to 18 was really increasing. And psychostimulants such as methamphetamine, amphetamines were also increasing to cause more deaths. Next slide. This just shows that from a national perspective, the number of new heroin users, which was increased 135%, which is still a lot, it didn't pace the number of deaths. The number of deaths from 2002 up to 2016 was 533%. So we were seeing a lot more use of drugs that were killing people, as opposed to new people starting to use heroin. Next slide. This is for our state. What we have seen is, as I told you, in 2017 to 2018, 2019, we were really starting to see less deaths through education, less people using drugs, the use of naloxone, which I'll talk about in a minute, less prescription opiates being used. But unfortunately, in 2020, we've seen a dramatic spike in overdose deaths from drugs. Along with that, we've also seen a dramatic spike in mental health crisis and also in suicide rate within our state and all throughout the United States. And a lot of it's because of what's gone on with COVID, coronavirus, and the effects that that has had on people losing their jobs, people not being able, losing their jobs, then not being able to provide food and stuff. So we've seen a lot of the effects. And also with our school age children here in Clark County, over the past year, we saw 21 suicides within our schools because of the pressures and problems with everything going on with coronavirus and other stressors. Next slide. This slide just shows you the type of drug that was involved in the deaths from 2010 to 2020. And you can see the biggest spike was those synthetic opioids that we talked about, whereas most of the others really kind of flattened or decreased. Next slide. This is, again, our overdose deaths, just showing what that last graph showed you, but showing it in a graph form. Next slide. And this is opioid related deaths from 2016 through December of 2020. It looks like there's a decrease in 2020, but what I'll tell you is we are still getting the numbers from December of 2020 in our opioid related deaths here in our state. And you can see there's been a dramatic spike in opioid related deaths in 2020. Next slide. This, again, is just a table showing what that last graph showed you is the increase we've seen from 374 opioid deaths in 19 to 484. Next slide. I think that number from 2020 will go up as the numbers are finalized. I want to talk a little bit about Washoe County and then also Clark County, what the medical examiner was seeing from 2012 to 15. As you can see, a 57% increase in drug overdose rates from 2016 to 17. 33% increase in opioid related deaths from 2016 to 17. And the most common opiates they found were oxycodone, fentanyl, morphine, and methadone. Next slide. And then this particular one shows you from 2017, Q4, that's the fourth quarter, Q1's the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, up to the third quarter of 2020. You can see the deaths and the type of medication or type of drug that caused that death. Next slide. Clark County saw similar to what we saw up in Washoe, but the largest increase from 2012 to 17 by drug type was psychostimulants. Methamphetamines is a real problem down in Clark County. Synthetic opioids, like we talked about, 163% increase, heroin 74. And we were also seeing deaths with heroin that it was a mixture, or what we call polydrug use, where there was a psychostimulant and heroin in the person's system. Next slide. This is from Clark County coroners for, you can see 2015 through 2020. What really stands out here, cocaine deaths in Clark County, 39% increase. Fentanyl deaths, 196% increase. And methamphetamine was a 23% increase. And from 2019 into 2020, there was a 31% change or increase in the amount of deaths we saw in Clark County for 2020. Next slide. And this becomes important. I talked to you about the fact of we were seeing a leveling off or a decreasing in our overdose deaths from 2017, 2018, 2019. But in 2020, they dramatically increased, in the National Drug Helpline, based on the calls that they were getting, placed 28 states on a red alert during the coronavirus pandemic. Next slide. Of those 28 states that were on high risk, you can see on here, these are them, and our state was included in that 28 states that saw a significant increase in their drug overdose deaths during the pandemic. Next slide. These slides, I'm just going to have Sam go through quickly in a minute. This will show you from 1999, they call it drug mortality, drug poisoning. Basically, with our coroners and medical examiners, a drug death is considered a drug poisoning. So that's why they call it. What you'll see is blue. The dark blues are lower numbers. And as we get up into the reds, you'll see from 1999, I think it goes through 2020 in our state, and look specifically at our state, and then look at your area within the state so that you can see how it goes from light blues to dark blues up into the red. So Sam, go ahead and click through these slides. There's from 1999 to 2016. Keep going. You can see that it's starting to change a little bit as we go. In the United States, there's more red. We're starting to get into the lighter colors in our state. Keep going as we go through. You can see down there, Nye County is starting to get into the orange color, whites. You can see it keeps now, Nye County is red, 2017 or 27, 28. We're starting to get some oranges up near you guys' area. 2010, it becomes more dramatic throughout our state. Keep going. I think it goes to 2016, just you can stop at 2016. So 2016, you can see our state no longer had any of those dark blues. Our state went to drug overdose deaths in these dark red and oranges. There's only 2 that are in that light blue range, or 3 areas in our state that are light blue. The rest are all into the yellows and into the reds. So it became problematic. It doesn't go out to 2020, but as I told you, we started to see decrease because of some of the efforts we put in. Next slide. Opiate overdoses has affected our children, nearly doubling. So you can see on here, there's 3 categories, and these are slightly older. I don't have current, but admissions for opiate overdoses of children to hospitals went from 797 to over 1,500. And then 1 to 5-year-olds accounted for 1/3 of those. We believe that this was accidental ingestion of the drugs. And then the 12 to 17-year-old were the largest group, accounting for 60% of the drug overdose of children. Next slide. I just want to talk to you briefly about some legislation that has been enacted within our state to help address, and what we were seeing is a decrease in drug overdoses within our state. One is called AB 474, Assembly Bill 474. This basically was our prescription drug monitoring program, which required that prescribers of narcotics, of opiates, have to look at the prescription drug monitoring so that people wouldn't be going to 3 or 4 different doctors trying to get opioid prescriptions, for example, and then also to start decreasing the amount of opiates that are being prescribed for non-chronic pain like cancer pain. So there's much more in the legislation, but that's why it becomes important. It became an important tool in decreasing overdoses. And then the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act, it has a number of things in it, but a couple of highlights for you is that the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act allowed us to use and distribute naloxone. Naloxone is a drug that if it's given to someone who has opiates in their system, it will stop the effects of that opiate overdose, for example. And it literally, I've seen people who have stopped breathing and been given this naloxone, and it can bring them right back because it reverses or stops those effects of the opiates. That was one of the things. The other thing that we were seeing both in our state and throughout the United States is that when police, paramedics would arrive on scene of someone who overdosed, it would be very apparent that other people had been there with that person that overdosed, but they all left and didn't call 911, and the person died. So what the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act said was that if someone is with someone who overdoses and they call 911 and stay with the person, they won't be arrested for that drug use because they're trying to save the person's life. So that's some of the highlights. There's other things again in this, but those are the highlights. Next slide. What I would call out to you all is that call to action is that the Drug Enforcement Administration's National Prescription Drug Take Back Day is April 24th of 2021 this year. If in your homes there are medications that are no longer being used, take those to these prescription drug take back days and get rid of those drugs that are no longer needed, that are in the homes and the medicine cabinets of houses. Oftentimes people will get prescriptions for an opiate for pain and only take a couple of them and keep that prescription bottle in there in case they use it later. Those are the types of things that we would like to see at the drug turned in at the drug take back days. And I will let Sam talk about where it is occurring and the specifics around it and some of the things that partnership Carson City is doing to help with getting rid of some of these drugs that are no longer used.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, so hey guys, our drug take back day, I'm sure that you guys have probably seen us every April and October. It's where we sit out in front of your grocery stores. So we utilize both Save Marts, North and South, Smith's, and then food banks. And so we sit out front of those grocery stores and we basically take back any sort of medications that you no longer want in your homes. So it can be anything from over-the-counter stuff if you don't want NyQuil in your home or anything like that. Prescription pills, maybe pills that have been expired, maybe stuff that has been prescribed to you or your parents. Anything that you do not want in your home, you can bring it straight to us and we completely get rid of it. We incinerate it. So you don't have to worry about anyone knowing whose name is on the prescription bottle, anything like that. Everything is completely incinerated. And another thing I will say too, which is usually a taboo topic, but we also collect sharps, meaning needles. And so a lot of people think that, you know, if you're turning in needles, it might be heroin needles or anything. But if anyone in your family is diabetic, or maybe you have needles because you're prescribing your pet medications, anything like that, you can also bring that to us as well, because we do properly get rid of all of those. So April 24th, all the grocery stores in Carson City from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Just bring us anything drug related you don't want in your home. Like I said, anything that's prescribed to, over-the-counter medications, any sort of needles, diabetic needles, pet needles, anything like that. Just bring it to us and we'll properly dispose of that. There's no questions asked. You just bring it to us and we get rid of it for you.
What I would add to what Sam said is don't flush your medications down the toilet. The Environmental Protection Agency has looked at water supplies, and that does get in the water supply. So it's much better to take it for the drug take back day. And I think you guys also have the deter bags too, don't you, Sam?
Yeah, so if you guys totally forget what day the take back day is, I know that Miss Bean is actually also a really good resource, but you could reach out to Miss Bean or you could reach out to us because we have at-home disposal kits. So if you don't make it to the drug take back day, you can get these take-home kits, and basically what you do is you just put any of the pills, liquids, patches, anything that you want to dispose of into these packages, you add some water, and then they safely dispose of it so that you can throw it away in your normal trash so it won't pollute the water supply. We don't want you throwing them down the drain. So if you can't make the drug take back day, or maybe you can't make it in the future and you do have stuff you want to get rid of in the meantime, you can also utilize Miss Bean and Partnership Carson City to get those at-home disposal kits that you can dispose of at any time in your own home.
If you'll advance to the next slide, it just is, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions.
So if anyone has any questions, if you just want to write them in the chat for Terry, and then I will monitor those and we will get those going. If you have any comments as well too, question for her. We just want to get those answered. Going once, going twice. Any questions at all?
I actually see a question in here. The question is, is addiction caused by the way it makes you feel or the feeling? And addiction, it's not really caused by the way it makes you feel, but what addiction is caused is because, like we talked about, that there's changes in the brain and changes in the body, so that people can become addicted because they like the way the medication makes them feel or the drug makes them feel, but it's that continued use and having to take more and more to get the same effects that they got when they first started taking it. So that's what is addiction. Addiction is that the person's life becomes consumed by getting whatever it is that they're taking so that they can have those same feelings they had previously. So it, and there's a phrase that I've heard, it's called chasing the dragon. And someone who becomes chronically addicted to drugs, they're always chasing that feeling they had when they first used it, but they'll never ever get that same feeling because all of those processes are going on that we talked about, the decreased ability to use the dopamine, mean decreased receptors. So they will never get that same feeling, but the addiction is characterized by that compulsivity to get the drug to try to get that feeling again, and where it kind of takes over the person's life. I hope that answered your question.
And it looks like, Tara, we have another one. So this one says, what happens to me when the doctor figure out the mom has been taking drugs after the baby has been born? So, for example,
It depends. There are cases that have happened where the mother and the baby have been separated, but there are a lot of programs. There's programs here in Clark County, and there's programs I know up in the Washoe area where there are physicians who will work with the moms if the moms are addicted in order to get them through the pregnancy. Some moms will want to get off of the drugs, but can't. And then they'll work with them so that the babies don't have as bad of effects that we talked about earlier in the presentation. And that so they can try to keep the mom and the baby together so that, the mom doesn't continue to be addicted and her whole scope in life is getting the drug, but where she can be a parent. So there are different medications and behavioral health counseling and those sort of things that they work with them. It can lead to a mom and a baby being separated if the mom does not get off the drugs, if she, endangers the children. That really becomes the question, is the endangerment of the child.
so a follow-up to that is she also wants to know, but what if the mom can't afford the help?
So here in our state, there have been funds provided so that the moms can get into these programs. I know that at some of the hospitals down here in Clark and some of the hospitals up in Washoe, they have been provided grant funding, or they can try to get the moms on Medicaid so that the Medicaid would pay for that. But just because she can't afford it doesn't mean it wouldn't happen, because there is grant funding provided, because we're better off to keep the mom and baby together. We're better off to decrease the effects on the baby, because you saw those babies have long lengths of stays. The programs that are in place, I've seen some of the numbers, and it's dramatic, the amount of savings by being able to help a mom when she's pregnant, for both the mom and the baby. So there is funding that is available.
The student said thank you for your answer. She really appreciates them.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any last minute questions for Terry? We have thank you for presenting. It was very nice.
You're welcome.
We have a couple other students said that they definitely learned a lot, and thank you for this.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I
Well,
appreciate the opportunity, and I'll turn it back to Sam.
thank you. And we want to thank you, Terry, so much for your presentation. And it looks like we've had a lot of positive feedback from the students. I want to thank everyone who has asked questions. You guys have asked amazing questions, and I really appreciate your engagement in this. Next Thursday, we're going to have Susie Rubio from Health and Human Services speak about vaping and the dangers about that. So if you'll tune in with us next Thursday at 6 p.m. again, at the same time, same Zoom link to talk about vaping. But we appreciate you all for being here tonight, and thank you very much, Terry, and thank you very much, Erin Bean, for helping to put this on.
You're welcome.
And with that being said, you guys are all welcome to enjoy the rest of your night, and thank you all.
Bye.